In 2008, a Russian archaeologist working in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia found a fragment of bone, not a skull, not a jaw, not even a full finger. Just a piece of a pinky finger, roughly the size of a small marble, belonging to what appeared to be a young girl who had died somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. Under normal circumstances, a fragment that small would have told us almost nothing. It would have been catalogued, stored, and largely forgotten. Instead, it rewrote human history. When scientists extracted DNA from that tiny piece of bone and ran the analysis, they found something that nobody expected. This wasn't a Neanderthal. It wasn't a modern human. It was something else entirely, a previously unknown species of archaic human that had been living alongside both Neanderthals and our own ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving virtually no trace in the fossil record, and yet whose DNA can still be found today in the bodies of millions of people across Asia and the Pacific. We call them the Denisovans, named after the cave where that fragment was found. And to this day, they remain one of the most mysterious and fascinating chapters in the entire story of human evolution. The extraordinary part is not just what we've discovered about them. It's how little we still know, and how much that little has already changed everything. To understand why the Denisovan discovery was so significant, you have to appreciate how the field of paleoanthropology traditionally worked before ancient DNA analysis became viable. For most of the 20th century, identifying a new human species meant finding bones, ideally skulls, jaws, or other distinctive skeletal remains, and comparing their physical characteristics to known species. It was painstaking, often contentious work, and it left enormous gaps in the record simply because bones don't preserve well over tens of thousands of years. The Denisovans bypassed all of that entirely. We didn't identify them from their anatomy, we identified them from their genome. And that single methodological shift opened a door that had been closed for the entire history of the discipline. The fingerbone fragment, formally catalogued as Denisova 3, belonged to a female who was between 5 and 7 years old at the time of her death. The DNA extracted from her bone was in remarkable condition given its age, and when sequenced, it revealed a lineage that had diverged from the ancestors of Neanderthals approximately 400,000 years ago, making the Denisovans a sister group to Neanderthals, both of them having split from the lineage that would eventually produce modern humans even earlier, roughly 550,000 to 765,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, at the time Denisovans and Neanderthals were going their separate evolutionary ways, our own ancestors in Africa were still hundreds of thousands of years away from producing anything that looked like us. What followed the initial discovery only deepened the mystery. A second molar tooth was found in the same cave, then a toe bone, then a fragment of skull. Later, in 2019, a piece of jawbone was found in a Tibetan cave called Baishia Karst, over 3,000 kilometers from Denisova, at an altitude of 3,280 meters or 10,761 feet above sea level. This wasn't just geographically significant. It suggested that the Denisovans had adapted to survive in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, at high altitude with thin air and brutal cold, thousands of years before modern humans would struggle to do the same thing. That's the entire physical fossil record of the Denisovans: a finger bone, 2 teeth, a toe bone, a skull fragment, a jawbone from Tibet. In terms of skeletal remains, we know less about the Denisovans than we know about almost any other human species, and yet, paradoxically, we know more about their genetics than we know about many species with far better fossil records. Here is where things get genuinely strange in the best possible way. The Denisovan genome, reconstructed from those fragmentary remains with increasing precision over the past decade, has revealed a population history of staggering complexity. For starters, the Denisovans were not a single unified population. Genetic analysis suggests there were at least 3 distinct Denisovan populations that were as different from each other genetically as modern Europeans are from modern Africans' populations that had been separated long enough, developed significant genetic divergence, and that appear to have ranged across an enormous geographic area, stretching from Siberia to Southeast Asia and possibly further. The Denisova cave itself tells a particularly striking story about what life was like for these different groups of archaic humans sharing the same world. Analysis of sediment layers in the cave has revealed that at various points in its history, it was occupied by Denisovans, by Neanderthals, and in later periods by modern humans. These weren't simultaneous occupations, at least not usually, but they were close enough in time that the groups must have been aware of each other's existence. And then, in 2018, came a discovery that removed all doubt about the level of interaction between these groups. Scientists announced the identification of a bone fragment belonging to an individual they called Denny. Denny was the child of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, first-generation hybrid. The two species had not merely encountered each other, they had produced offspring together, and that offspring had survived long enough to leave behind a bone. This was not an isolated incident either, as genetic analysis of both Neanderthal and Denisovan populations has found evidence of multiple interbreeding events between the two groups over tens of thousands of years. And it wasn't just with each other. The Denisovans also interbred with modern humans, and the evidence of that is still walking around today. Of all the things the Denisovan discovery revealed, perhaps the most mind-bending is this. Between 4 and 6% of the genome of modern Melanesian peoples, the indigenous populations of Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and nearby regions, is Denisovan in origin. In Aboriginal Australians, the figure is similar. In mainland East Asian populations, it's lower, but still detectable, typically around 0.2%. In people of European or African descent, it's essentially 0. This distribution tells a story. At some point after modern humans left Africa and spread eastward, they encountered Denisovan populations in Southeast Asia or the Pacific region, and they interbred with them. The descendants of those encounters carried Denisovan DNA with them as they spread into Australia and the Pacific Islands, where it remains to this day in unusually high concentrations. The fact that the percentages are so much higher in Melanesian and Aboriginal populations than in mainland Asian populations suggests the interbreeding may have happened relatively late, possibly in island Southeast Asia, and that the populations who moved further east and south carried more of that genetic legacy with them. What did those Denisovan genes actually do for the people who inherited them? In at least one case, the answer is dramatic and well documented. A gene variant called EPAS1, which regulates the body's response to low oxygen levels at high altitude, is found in unusually high frequencies in Tibetan people, and it is Denisovan in origin. Modern humans who tried to live at high altitude without this gene variant suffered from a condition called chronic mountain sickness, where the body produces too many red blood cells in response to thin air, thickening the blood and causing serious cardiovascular problems. Tibetans, with the Denisovan version of EPAS1, don't have this problem. Their bodies regulate oxygen more efficiently at altitude, and they've been living on the Tibetan Plateau, the highest and largest plateau on Earth, for thousands of years as a result. In other words, modern humans effectively borrowed a high-altitude adaptation from the Denisovans, a species that had apparently been living successfully at extreme elevation long before we arrived. The Tibetan jawbone found at Baishia Karst dates to at least 160,000 years ago. Modern humans didn't arrive in Tibet in significant numbers until much later. The Denisovans had been solving the altitude problem for over 100,000 years before we even showed up, and they essentially handed us the solution through interbreeding. Other potential Denisovan gene contributions in modern human populations include variants associated with immune function, fat metabolism, and skin and hair characteristics, all potentially useful adaptations in the cold, harsh environments where Denisovan populations thrived. The full picture of what we inherited from them is still being mapped, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the Denisovan contribution to modern human biology was not trivial. This is the question everyone wants answered, and the one the evidence is least equipped to address. With almost no skeletal material to work with, reconstructing the physical appearance of a Denisovan is genuinely difficult. What we do have is genetics, and geneticists have developed methods to predict certain physical traits from ancient DNA, but these methods are imprecise, and the results come with significant caveats. What the genetic analysis suggests is that Denisovans likely had dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes, features broadly consistent with the genetic profiles of other archaic human populations. Their skulls, based on the limited fragments available, appear to have been large and robust, possibly even larger than Neanderthal skulls, suggesting substantial brains and the thick, heavy bone structure associated with archaic humans generally. The molar teeth found at Denisova Cave are particularly revealing. They are enormous, larger than Neanderthal molars, larger than any modern human molar, and in the case of the second specimen so large that when it was first analyzed, researchers initially wondered if it might belong to a completely different and even older hominin species rather than the same one as the finger bone. The size of those teeth implies jaw muscles and a facial structure that was probably significantly more robust and projecting than what we see in modern humans, closer in overall appearance to earlier Homo species than to us. The Tibetan jawbone confirmed this impression. It was massively built, with a broad ramus and teeth that were again strikingly large. Whoever the Denisovans were physically, they were not gracile. They were built for a hard world. One particularly interesting attempt to reconstruct Denisovan appearance came in 2019, when a team of researchers used patterns of DNA methylation chemical modifications to the genome that affect how genes are expressed to predict the skeletal anatomy of Denisovans based on comparisons with known skeletal features in Neanderthals and modern humans. The result was a reconstructed skull that showed a wide face, a projecting brow, a large cranial vault, and a chin that receded similarly to Neanderthals. It was, in essence, a face that would have been recognizably human but unmistakably archaic, something you would know immediately was not a modern human if you saw it on the street, but something that would also be recognizably more like us than a chimpanzee. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. This was a species intelligent enough to survive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They used tools. There is evidence they may have made jewelry. A perforated animal tooth pendant and a tubular bone bead were found in the same layers of Denisova Cave as Denisovan remains, though whether these objects were made by Denisovans or Neanderthals remains debated. They interbred with two other human species and left genetic adaptations that are still helping people survive at extreme altitude today. And we almost didn't know they existed at all. The Denisovans disappear from the fossil and genetic record sometime after 30,000 years ago, though pinning down an exact date is essentially impossible, given how little material we have. The timing roughly coincides with the spread of modern humans across Asia, which is suggestive but not conclusive. The same pattern played out with Neanderthals in Europe, where their disappearance also broadly coincides with the arrival of modern humans, though the exact mechanisms remain hotly debated. The leading hypotheses for Denisovan extinction follow similar lines to those proposed for Neanderthals: competition with modern humans for resources, potential conflict, interbreeding that gradually absorbed smaller populations into larger ones, and climate change that may have reduced and fragmented their habitats. The truth is almost certainly some combination of all of these, and the relative weight of each factor probably varied by region and population. What is clear is that they didn't simply vanish without a trace. They left their DNA in millions of people alive today. They left a high-altitude gene that is keeping Tibetan communities healthy on the roof of the world. They left a handful of teeth and bone fragments in a Siberian cave that, against all odds, survived long enough for us to find them and understand what they were. The Denisovan story is still being written. New ancient DNA techniques are improving every year, and researchers are actively searching for additional remains across the vast geographic range these people apparently occupied. Every few years, a new piece of the puzzle appears, a new genome sequence, a new fossil, a new analysis of existing material that reveals something previously unseen. What the Denisovans have already taught us, more than anything else, is that the story of human evolution was not a clean linear progression from primitive to modern. It was messy, branching, interconnected, a world populated by multiple human species living in overlapping ranges, interbreeding across species lines, competing and cooperating, and ultimately merging into the single remaining human lineage that survived. We are not the product of one people. We are the product of many. And somewhere in the genome of a person living in Papua New Guinea or on a Tibetan mountainside, the Denisovans are still alive in the only way that, after 30,000 years, anything can still be alive. In fragments, in echoes, in the bodies of people who will never know their name.